Right, my name is Glenn. I'm going to talk to you about something I've been working on for a while with some other smart people about what CSS is, what it can be, where it's going. My contribution is a thing called Interoperable CSS, and I've put the tagline, "Welcome to the future." Initially it was going to be like, because the whole talk was going to be super bold and I was going to be like super confident, but then I ran out of time preparing. So I like to think that the welcome to the future part means that the good version of this talk is still in the future somewhere. But the first bit I think is all right, so let's start with that. Let's show of hands. How many people would say they use JavaScript day to day? Not CSS, JavaScript. So probably a bit more than half, I would say. And how many people were here last month and saw Mark's talk about CSS modules? Okay, so a bit under half, maybe a third. Okay, so this talk is really for people who put their hand up twice. So there's about a sixth of you out there. But for those who don't, hopefully it's not too esoteric. I want everyone to think back to September 1st, 2008. It was a very important date. I don't know what, if you can remember exactly what you were doing. I certainly can't. The iPhone 3G had come out a couple of months before, so I think I had one at that point. It was my first iPhone, and I thought the world was a whole new place, and I guess it was. Tropic Thunder was the leading film in the box office. A lot of my friends went and saw it and liked it, and I went and saw it and I hated it. I remember that. We were about here in the global financial crisis. So I guess, so I guess it wasn't all, the outlook wasn't all rosy. But I do have a better graph for you, a nicer graph. Is that this is Justin Bieber's views over his career for his first sort of original song on YouTube. So basically nobody had heard of Justin Bieber at that point, which I think makes it a much happier time. And at that time, this is how we did JavaScript, right? 2008. This is a slide pulled straight from Mark's talk last week. If your code depends on something else, you don't have to import it, you just assume that it's there. Right? And you also have to be aware that other code is run. You're not sure what the state of the world will be when your code is run. So you're careful to basically keep a tidy house, right? And so you don't override anything. If it's already there, you just piggyback on it. Then foobar is the thing that you're doing, so you just clobber that, right? Now, September 2nd was the day after, and that's when Chrome was released, right? I don't know if you remember, this was a cool comic that they released to tell everybody that they just reinvented the browser to try and educate most people what a browser was. Because you either knew what a browser was and were using Firefox, or you didn't know what a browser was and you were using IE. And this was a pretty effective launch strategy, right? But at the same time, they launched V8, right? And V8 actually sort of changed what JavaScript could be. V8 made it appear fast, like it was demonstrably fast. A little bit later, a few months, January 2009, a guy called Kevin Dangor, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, wrote a blog post where he introduced this idea of server.js as a new standard. Right? He said, JavaScript needs a standard way to include other modules, and for those modules to live in discrete namespaces. There are easy ways to do namespaces, in fact I've shown you one, but there's no standard programmatic way to load a module once. This is really important because server-side apps can include a lot of code and will likely mix and match parts that meet those standard interfaces if we build it. He then started a spec called server.js and went on to say, server-side JavaScript is very fragmented. A script that, say, accesses files can't be used without modification between Rhino, which is the JVM-based VM, and V8, the new one. SpiderMonkey and JavaScript Core, which are the in-browser JavaScript libraries, can't do that. They can't load it in the same way. And so a framework is very much tied to its interpreter and is often forced to create a bunch of APIs that Python, Ruby, and Java programmers take for granted, right? And this is sort of the beginning of JavaScript coming into, its own. Chris Cowell wrote which I only found today, interoperable JavaScript modules, good word, where he said, "The year has begun with a combination of wondrous events in the JavaScript theater. I've been struggling to promote the idea of a module system in JavaScript for several years now. There has been a sudden explosion of ideas." NodeJS was started around this time, and the convergence of all those people and all those ideas and this upswell in popularity gave us CommonJS, right? It was basically, Server.js got renamed. And what CommonJS is taking that window namespace code and replacing it with being explicit about what you depend on and being explicit about what you export, what you give back, right? And that was pretty popular. CommonJS actually, as a spec, tried to move on, but Node.js basically stayed and said, cool, we've got enough. We can build an entire ecosystem. So whatever Node does is actually the standard. James Halliday calls it CommonJS, which is this sort of slightly reduced form, and it hasn't really changed. And this is what happened to Node, right? NPM is the red line here. Now I know number of modules doesn't really count for much, but you can see the impact and the rate at which the Node community has grown. So I can all hear you thinking, sweet JavaScript history lesson, right? Like, that was great, cool, didn't come for that. Maybe you've understood that I'm making an analogy to CSS at this point. What we've been working on is this idea of ICSS, which stands for Interoperable CSS. And I wrote a blog post about introducing this idea back in June. If you saw the CSS modules talk last week, then ICSS is what the browser, or what the loader actually runs. CSS modules is a series of transformations from whatever you write, your CSS modules language, to this thing called ICSS. So going back to those quotes from before and replacing some sections, the language needs a standard way to include other modules, and for those modules to live in discrete namespaces. There are easy ways to do namespaces. It is completely true of CSS. You have no way to say what you're expecting is coming above your line of CSS. It just is. It's just your environment. And there's no way for you to say, what do I want the browser to actually interpret from my CSS? Everything you write just goes into the browser. And that's true with Sass as well. When you're importing variables and mixins, yes, you get some higher level concepts, but you're still building one global soup of runtime environment. So there's no way to say that some widget is defined in mixins and primary is defined in variables. It's just convention. So going back to another of the quotes, the language is very fragmented. A script, any CSS script that does something beyond what CSS can do, can't be used, can't be ported to other ideas, can't be shared between languages, between sort of preprocessors. And any frameworks that are built are really tied to their interpreter. So the interpreter here would be less or Sass. And they're often forced to create a bunch of core functionality that working with other languages take for granted. Now I changed that from programmers of other languages because we all use other languages alongside CSS. And we see that those languages are real languages and CSS isn't. So ICSS is two things and nothing more. It is the idea that you can export across a boundary from CSS to JavaScript. So here you're saying, I'm going to export the term nav, and I'm going to give it some gibberish. And then I'm going to export the term logo and give it different gibberish. And then the rest of the file is just pure CSS, except these class selectors are, absolutely unreadable, right? But they're also guaranteed to be global, which means you can import this file, you can grab it across the boundary from CSS to JavaScript, and those tokens are available to you. And I'll show you how that works in a sec. The other is import, because it's no good to be able to export if you have to concatenate everything into one file before you do so. I copied the wrong. Oh, that's right. Sorry. In the utils file, I make some exports, and anything that one file exports, another file could import. And so basically, I'm saying that in that second code snippet there, I have used these terms I util class 1 all through this code, and I util var 1 all through this code, and whatever utils actually exports is what I want it to be replaced with. So it's simple sort of substitution, but it has very clear semantics about where information is going, what can leak where. You have to explicitly export something for it to be imported. And that's all ICSS is, which is why it's been sort of possible to get it working, I guess, without it being a research project of my own for a long time. So I want to demonstrate it working, just to give you a sense of how it can be used. But be aware that CSS modules is the user-facing thing and compiles to ICSS. So you're probably not going to be writing the code that I'm about to demonstrate yourself. But it is, I still think, useful to understand that this is the new CommonJS, but for CSS, and then we can build whatever we want on top of it. Right, so this is something I prepared earlier. This is a JSPM project. So JSPM is like Webpack or Browserify. It's a way to make a lot of different types of resources, including JavaScript, ES6, and CSS, available to the browser. So it's kind of like Require.js, but the next generation. What I'm doing here is I have a little script that grabs a part of the DOM and overwrites it with this multi-line ES6 string to say here. So I think if I delete that, it should just disappear. Everything's live reloading. Whew, thanks. What I'm doing here is I'm importing these styles. So this is one of the kind of key parts. This is what makes ICSS possible, is this idea that at some point you have the JavaScript asking the CSS, like loading the CSS, referencing the CSS. So the CSS here, it's just normal CSS. There's nothing special about it, right? And as a result of it being loaded, I'm able to output the styles object, which is coming here as an empty string, as an empty object. What I was saying is this is a normal CSS file, nothing special about it, but because of the way JSPM loads CSS, and Webpack by default as well. Now, Browserify, you do need a plugin to make this happen, but Webpack and JSPM should let you arbitrarily send data from CSS across the boundary to JavaScript. So what's happening there is this CSS file is being injected into the browser because the browser understands CSS. And the export parts are being sent to JavaScript. And what that lets you do is abstract away the names that you use. So CSS modules does this by default, but there's sort of a manual version, which is if I say local, we should see that, again, we lose some styles, but this header term has been exported as well. So that's CSS modules behavior. That's the same as doing this. That's what it's compiling to. And that lets you, instead of targeting this tag selector, which means that these styles are going to be applied to every header that you've got on your page, now you have no styles that target the global header, but you can do, and it snaps back, right? And this can be foo. And honestly, quite often, I will start styling with the words foo, bar, baz, a, b, whatever just makes me stop trying to think of a name and start writing the styles. Because actually thinking about, like, if every variable used in JavaScript was potentially global and you couldn't use the name again, you would be paralyzed choosing variable names. So why do we do it in CSS? Just to show you how this works, something like, let's say, globals.css. Let's say it doesn't export anything. Well, suddenly we lost our styles. pop them in, and they're back. And just to show that, hello? Okay. Right, that is working. That is live reloading. And so now we've been able to say, just like we could with JavaScript once we had CommonJS, if styles aren't related to each other and they're better described by being in multiple files, we can use this @import syntax. Now I know that there's an @import, the colon import, similar to the @import from CSS, but it does mean that, say, if we said something like import typography, then suddenly we can do something here, which is like tell this that h1 matches to that class name, and then here we can say I want my temp var to be whatever h1 was in typography, and then I can say h1 here, or let's just say, yeah, heading, something like that. It can be this temp var. And just like passing variables through, so actually that should be h1. That's not seem to be working. But, No. Well, it turns out that writing this by hand is why you don't write this by hand. This is why it's a compile target. No, not here, no. Sorry? Should be heading, temp var, h1. Oh, heading is really big style. It's just that it doesn't actually have any styles. Hey? You reckon it's my markup? I didn't do a string interpolation. Oh, what's happening now? Heading is not fine. Styles.heading. Right. This is why people don't live code. I am example 600 of dumb people to try and live code. Right. So now we go back, right? Oh, so it's just using base styles for this. This is a pretty bad demo. All right. All right, cool. So that functionality exposes the ability for something here to be, for this composers keyword in CSS modules, which is kind of where all the power comes through. So the point I'm trying to make is that if you read up about CSS modules and you think something is neat or useful or whatever, it's powered by ICSS, right? ICSS is also an evolving specification. At the moment, it actually has enough power to do everything we want to do with CSS modules from right now until, everything we can think of. If you write something that compiles to ICSS, if you have a cool idea to extend CSS modules in some way or to do something completely different, you don't need our permission to do it. You can write your own and target ICSS and then share it with people, and it will work for any person using Webpack Browser Fire JSPN. In the same way that it doesn't matter what language you're compiling from, if you use Browserify or something, it will run in the browser. And that's what we're trying to do with ICSS. We're trying to give people a new standard to make this functionality available without telling them how they should use it. So the current area of interest is server-side rendering, right? Because if you're using React, this is really easy to use because you might be using Webpack or something, so pulling in your CSS is easy. But if you've got a static site, then this doesn't offer you anything. Except there's nothing about ICSS that's tied to runtime React. All it needs is your ability to change the styles in markup to match what's coming out of the CSS. So putting into NodeJS server-side templates, putting into Rails, any kind of PHP, anything basically, should be able to be supported. And that's what I got. Thanks.